I do since the last 20 years. Well, you see, I was born a European. I discovered that I was a European when I left Europe at the age of 11 from a displaced persons camp in Germany to go to North Africa. And it's in North Africa, in the French protectorate of Morocco, that I discovered that I was a European. But then within 5 or 6 years, we left for North America, and I spent most of my life in North America. So at that time, I discovered that Canadians are, first of all, that I was a new Canadian, which was strange to have now a different label, you see. I'd been labeled a European for about 6 years now, and a foreigner by the French. Now I was labeled as a new Canadian, which was equivalent to saying a foreigner by the Canadians. But then I discovered that Canadians have all sorts of hyphenated. They're French Canadians, and they're Anglo-Canadians, and Irish, and Italian, and Latvian Canadians. So I became a Latvian identity, a Latvian Canadian, which means I had a mid-Atlantic identity for about half a century of my life. It means really caring about what happens to Europe as the number one. I think when Mr. Trump so grossly put it about America first, he really expressed openly what is a natural reaction, I think, for every human being. Our survival instincts not only urge us, but practically demand from us that we look after our own lives, about the community to which we belong, and the size of that community. You see, that is, I think, for the world as it stands now and the world of the future, what is going to be crucial for peace in the world and progress in the world is the ability of human beings to identify with ever larger, if you like, circles of like minds or like interests than had been the case in the past, or that still remains in many countries in the world today, where we have tribal wars going on and where people slaughter each other and mutilate each other for a simple fact that you belong to a different tribe than I. That sort of identification is extremely outdated, I would say, in human evolution. And our only hope is that future generations will learn that it is possible to identify with some place that gives you your roots and your sense of belonging and of mutual support. We're social animals. We need social support. But that this can be obtained without, of course, denigrating the other, without, first of all, well, of course, murdering them or mutilating them or oppressing them, ça va de soi, but that it is possible. And it's a challenge. And the European Union, in that sense, you see, to me, is a shining example of how people have managed to keep their own roots and belonging to a certain nation, and at the same time identify with the broader whole, which is Europe, with, I must say, with the exception of those in Great Britain who voted for Brexit. So obviously it's not for today and tomorrow that even on the European continent such a sense prevails, but I'm impressed by the fact that it prevails among so many people from so many very, very different lands with different histories. I think that's a remarkable achievement. I already answered that by saying that it was the moment when I left the European continent at the age of 11 and arrived on the North African continent, and immediately, because of my at the time blonde hair and sort of greenish blue eyes, I was visibly, immediately, at first glance, identified by everybody as a European, so that my appearance became the basis for the tag, and also the clothes I wore. Whereas when I arrived in Canada, it was different. In Canada, it didn't matter whether you came from Europe or somewhere else, at least not that I perceived it. You see, some people might differ from me in that sense, but I thought Canada was, from that point of view, I think as egalitarian as one might wish a country to be. And when you think of, I arrived there in the second half of the 50s, that's a long time ago. Oh, there's quite a few. I think that we would have, if you started having a beauty contest about what is the worst moment, I think the moment we're living right now, the pandemic, is horrific. We haven't begun to see the end of it. Europe has just started the vaccination program. It's yet to be seen how well it will succeed. Let's do hope and pray that it works and that it helps, because the effects on the economy, first of all, are already significant. The effects on people's mental health and social welfare are evident already. And after all, we are having a great deal of funerals. And that is a grim, grim thing. We're not alone, but it's a grim moment. The most significant moment for me was the ceremony, the official ceremony of flag raising, with Ireland presiding at the time, the European Union, in May 2004, when Latvia was one of the 10 new member states accepted into the Union. And I, as president of Latvia, was representing my country along with the then existing, the heads of state of the then existing members of the European Union, and these 10 new ones, all standing in line, and a choir, an Irish choir, singing "Ode to the Joy" while the flags are being raised. It was very emotional. EU as such, as a not a set of institutions, an idea, for me personally, hasn't done a thing. It's changed my life, but it's done so for a great many people. The thing that really changed my life is the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the European Union had nothing to do with that. It was supportive. It certainly didn't intervene, but the fact that it did accept it. Oh, there were certain reluctances, by the way, It wasn't always jumping up and down with joy and clapping its hands necessarily. There were some people worried in Europe about whether this might affect the equilibrium of powers in the world, and so on and so on. Again, it's one selfish interest, and saying, well, we were doing rather nicely. We had an equilibrium. Oh, this might shake things up. Well, yes, the collapse of the Soviet Union shook things up mercifully for millions and millions of people, including my compatriots in Latvia. So no, I can't point to anything that the Union as such has done for me. But if you turn the phrase around, how do I feel within that union? I feel wonderful. That's a different thing. Because it is what it is, you see, and I think it is such a unique project, and I'm very happy that in the tail end of my life, well, I was 60 when I returned. I was 6 when I left my native country, 60 when I returned to Latvia, repatriated, to say, and that I had this opportunity to become part of it again. I returned to my native soil, and curiously enough, as a refugee child, and kicking around from one continent to the next and to the third, always trying to somehow fit in, and starting from scratch and learning a new language and new customs and a new environment, to turn back to one's native soil and to have to again fit in. I mean, because obviously after a long absence, even though I had tried to keep in touch, I had to learn to fit in at the end of my life again. But it was returning to my roots. And you see, I was there to help my compatriots to form a new life, a new future, and a new present on the ruins of what I consider a hideous empire, the Soviet Empire. And that's the ability to participate in the reconstruction, in the rebirth of my country. That was, to me, as an individual, was a great privilege. But as I say, it is not due to the European Union as a union at all. It's due to a broad series of causes that make, you know, the wheel of history turn, and things change once somehow they're ripe to change. Within a decade, frankly, much before that, but I guess it's the die is already cast. I'm really shocked at the inequity, inequality, and injustice of the European agricultural support policy, which favors the earlier members at the expense of later ones. I think that is not compatible with the concept of egalitarian principles that the European Union is supposed to stand for. It is certainly not a fair system where countries in the south, where in many cases they can have two crops a year of whatever, and then the countries in the north where the soil is poor because of post-glacial sort of alluvial soils, and the climate is much more severe. It's an absurdity, and it's not the only one, but to me it's a screamingly unjust one, and it should have been, frankly, it should have been liquidated, eliminated. It's been 2004 is the year when we were admitted, and we're now in 2021, for heaven's sakes, and we still haven't got the same subsidies as other parts of Europe. That is absolutely unacceptable to my sense of fairness, to my personal sense of fairness. What kind of policy is a different argument and discussion altogether? You see, should there be one? How big a one? But if you have one, then it must be egalitarian. You cannot have, or it should be based on actual, if you like, objective factors and not historical political factors. Objective factors in terms of soil fertility, climate, etc., yes, but not on political considerations. After watching the Epiphany, on the Feast of the Epiphany in the United States of America, when an outgoing president actually incited a mob to go and use force to actually reject the will of the people under false pretenses and false and mendacious arguments. I thought that if the United States of America has a democracy that is in such dire straits, then all the allies of the United States of America must worry seriously. And you see, Mr. Trump, as outgoing president and pathological narcissist, is not the cause and not the reason for it. He represents a current of thought, if you like, a collective narcissism in a way of certain groups, but a collective narcissism that is distinctly anti-democratic. And the seriousness of this event, I think, is being a bit downplayed because people are scared of what it really means. Frankly, it makes my hair stand on end in fright, if you must actually, if you must know. As I was watching that, a Capitol that was erected as a, if you like, the symbol of the American democracy. The last time it was invaded and torched, I believe it was in 1814 by Canadian troops during the war of 1812 to 14. But they may have been British troops, concretely British troops that torched the capital. The independence of the United States as a republic, and it's at least the principles, if not always the practice, of its democracy, were being openly contested. But in Europe, we have pockets of the same sort of thing. Now, some of these pockets, what we saw in front of the Capitol buildings in Washington was a rabble made up of, I would say, a dozen at least different groups ideologically, because the few questions that the journalists were able to ask from members of the mob showed deep convictions that they were doing it for liberty, for their rights, for proper governance, and so on. But this sentiment is anti-government. And democracy is based on delegating authority. Elections are a way of delegating one's personal rights and authority to one's elected representatives, who then hopefully, of course, hopefully and ideally, would look after the common good, including that, and starting with that, of the people who put them in office. And the principle of democracy is that they're answerable to those who are in office. But also a principle is that they pack their bags when their time is up, because one believes in the principle of rotation. Here again, you see, Europe is in a very strange situation because it has quite a handful of constitutional monarchies. Now, a monarchy, by definition, is not democratic. You stretch it any way you want. A monarchy is hierarchic, and hierarchic by birth. Yet it's totally anti-democratic. But well, Europe has managed to find a model of somehow melding two very incompatible ideas: the equality of every citizen in front of the law and the privileges of birth of the ruling family, and in fact also a certain aristocracy with privileges as well that vary from country to country, even if they're privileges of rank only. It's a very strange, frankly, result of historical developments. You have countries like Greece and Portugal, and Austria, who simply renounced monarchy as a system, and others who continue to, for historical reasons and psychological reasons, continue to have it. But there's how shall I put it? There's a plethora of currents of thought from the lunatic fringe, because some of the people invading the capital said that they were attacking the pedophiles in the Congress. I mean, I don't want to comment on such a remark, but it seems to me that is hardly a political platform on which to stand. It seems to me a reaction, rather an emotional reaction to conspiracy theories. And there were a lot of people there who were there because they had been incited and encouraged and brainwashed, poor souls, brainwashed by ideas of conspiracy. And you see, what is worrisome is that the pandemic has sown fear in human souls. We're all scared. We never know when the virus could hit us or our family. We're living under this threat now for chronological, I mean a calendar year. I think that doesn't help. Or economic, losing your job, losing your home. Economic insecurity creates anxiety. And people then search for causes. They search for whom to blame. And this is where modern social media, I think, have become very dangerous as a vehicle for expressing extremist thoughts, which can spread just like a virus with electronical speed, and play on the natural anxieties of people and they're searching for something to hang on to, and give them simple, simplistic answers, which are extremely dangerous for the common good. Well, you see, nationalism has been given a bad name because it has been used as an excuse for racist and extremist views by people starting, I would say, specifically and in explicit ideological formulations with 19th century German pre-Nazi thought. Nationalism is otherwise known under different names and still very much accepted and admired under the name of patriotism. And Americans, frankly, have been since, I think, the creation of the Republic. Every morning in school, they salute the flag, and they in many countries, they recite some sort of oath of allegiance or something like that. When I went to Canada in the late 50s, the first time I went to a cinema, I was absolutely dumbstruck at having to stand up before a film because God Save the Queen was being played in a movie theater. You see? Now that's not nationalism. What is it called? Oh, it's called patriotism, I think, or what? You give it a different name. The oppressed nations of Europe, which for centuries had been tossed about, like in the eastern Baltic, the eastern shores of the Baltic, from Finland all the way down to Poland, where they had been the inhabitants, the autochthonous, the natives inhabitants, had been under various, in the case of Latvia, under various foreign rule. And in the 19th century, they started having a national awakening, which was an awakening of the oppressed classes, which were being oppressed, again, on racist grounds, simply because they were Latvian. They had been conquered by the Crusaders in the 13th century, and as such were considered unworthy of participating. They were, until the mid-19th century, Latvians were forbidden to live in cities in Courland. They were meant to be peasants. And when they started having their, what the French call revendication, presenting their claims not just as individuals for social mobility. I want to go to city because I have talents as a jeweler, you know, I'd like to be a jeweler, but the guild only accepts Germans and doesn't accept non-Germans. No, it was a collective sense of belonging to a group which speak the same language and have certain traditions and a certain culture in common. And that is not an evil thing at all. I think it's a rectifying of deep injustices that have lasted centuries. So please let us not tar with the same brush the legitimate, justified claims of nations that wish to have their own governments and wish to govern their own fate. Let's not mix that up with a kind of racism that will set some people above others. And this is where I say, but even constitutional monarchies, they slide they're on a slippery slope, you see, towards this inequality by birth. To me, as a descendant of centuries of people who were forced to be peasants, I find that a slippery slope that we should be very careful about. But do not have national identification. I'm a Hungarian and I'm a Pole, and these are very proud nations because of their history. Do not think that that alone is the problem. No, we must face up to what is it that they are unhappy about. If I understand, I cannot speak for the Poles, but the ones I've spoken to, in many cases, they feel that they are a Catholic nation, that's part of their history, and therefore, if you like, a Catholic ethic is extremely important to them, and they find that some of the liberal values that the European Union has embraced because it has accepted the separation of the French idea of the separation of church and state. That is the issue. It's not nationalism. The issue is about church and state ideology, liberal ideology versus conservative ideology. And that it happens to be, if you like, used by certain politicians because their power base is a national one. We should be very careful. I think in some sense our vocabulary here needs to be possibly revised. We have to rethink these ideas. This idea of saying nationalism is a problem as such. What kind of nationalism? Because you see, it depends where you stand. When Britain was sending millions of its young men to be slaughtered in the First World War, was that not nationalism? You see, when you talk about liberal democracy, again, this is it's a cliche. Let's face it. The idea of liberal democracy is a cliche. It's either your idol and that you put on a pedestal and you know, a god that you worship, or it's the image of all evil that is against moral values. The split between liberalism and conservatism goes back to what I was saying earlier about split between church and state. There are questions, political questions meld into or bleed into, if you like, they bleed into questions of moral values. And how society that we consider a just society or a desirable society, one that we would like to live in, the one that we would like to see others accept as the norm, this is an extremely difficult question. And the principles of democracy in terms of the equality, the fundamental thing of democracy, that, in my view, that's a personal view, if you like, because it's not a dogma that we haven't got the 10 commandments of democracy. We should have, maybe, I think. We do have the various declarations of the United Nations, which are not bad, by the way. Declaration of Human Rights, yeah, which just on 7th of December, I think we celebrated its anniversary. The Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations is worth rereading. It really is. And what, to me, what is the crucial thing? Equality of all human beings as an inherent right, which does not have to be earned, which does not depend on the merit of your parents or ancestors at the time of the Crusades, or a century ago, or 2 centuries ago, or 2 years ago. But on the moment of birth, and this is a radically, in many ways, it's a radical idea. Many people would say, and the Nazis did say, and so have done others in a more hidden way, that not some people, when they are born, are so obviously, nature has, you know, the DNA has had defects, and should they have the same rights? We have decided to accept that they do, because otherwise it's very difficult to draw the line, right? So first of all, democracy means every life is equal in value to every other life. Very difficult to accept. Millions of people today do not accept it, but that has to be accepted. You cannot have democracy if you don't accept every life has equal value. Every person has equal dignity, and every person has equal rights before the law. What the laws are, what the communal principles of cohabitation, if you like, in society, how you establish them, that is governance. And the concrete details of governance vary throughout history, and they vary from one country to another, and the understanding varies from one person to another. That is why we have parliaments. That is why in democracy we have parties, which, by the way, I have my doubts about whether the party structure as it stands could not be much improved, but never mind, that's a different question. We have at least the ability to debate it, but the refusal to debate it, to accept that there may be different views, that is what is anti-democratic. Starting in grade school, I think, the lessons are not just on human physiology and health instruction, but also psychology. And all of us start out life as helpless babies, totally dependent on adults to bring us up. And as we grow up progressively and acquire our own mind, we, of course, the adults around us try and put us within a certain framework, and we resist that framework as our own individuation, as Jung put it, proceeds. But you see, when things get tough, the child within us wakes up and says, oh, I wish mommy or daddy or auntie or uncle were here to solve the problem for me. I've skinned my knee and they put a plaster on it. Or they gave me a candy and say it will be better, and kiss me and say make it well. Do we really have a society where every single individual grows up to become a fully individuated, independent, autonomous, healthy, psychologically well-balanced individual? No. It's an ideal for the future. And this is the hick, you see, of the thing. How do we make an ideal society, a perfect society with imperfect elements, us as imperfect humans, as its elements? That's the challenge. Well, maybe this is that part of my past that has to do with psycholinguistics, but you see, identity is a word that's also badly misused because it's very polysemous. It has a variety of different meanings. When my country was preparing for a referendum on whether it wished to join the European Union, because our constitution states the power belongs to the people, if you like, in simple words. And here we're delegating part of our sovereignty to the European Union. Do you agree with that? And yes, they did agree with that. But one of the questions that was raised in the press and as I traveled across the country to talk to people about it, as president at the time, they said, what will it do to our Latvian identity? Is our Latvian identity going to be dissolved into this broader identity, sort of washed out, you see, and disappear? And frankly, I think that in the modern world, increasingly so as the years go by, certainly the decades flow by, the identity of people of the kind that I experienced as a European child going to North Africa is increasingly becoming washed out all over, period. In other words, I cannot tell by looking at somebody whether he's a chimney sweep or a baker or a candlestick maker, because we don't have sumptuary laws as Europeans used to have in the past. Okay, I'll grant you, when people wear designer clothes, it sort of tends to show. I'll admit that much. But when people run around in t-shirts and jeans, you know, the identity is not visible at a glance. And what I think we should be talking about instead, and what we really are worried about, is identification, a verb. If we can make a word out of it, you see. The process of identifying oneself, as I started out saying, I identify as an individual, I identify as a member of a family, of a tribe, of a nation, of a region, of a continent, of an idea, of a political concept or something, I identify it's a deliberate psychological decision, emotional and intellectual. Dry intellect alone doesn't do the job. And so far, the European identity has been, I think, there's too much dry intellect and not enough emotion in it. You have to sort of moisten it up with emotion as a glue, you see. And when you have emotion added on to the sense of solidarity with others, but a sense of solidarity that is not just bureaucratic, that is not just trade agreements and profit making for large corporations or small businesses or whatever, but that I, as a person, as an individual, feel that yes, that other person is also part of the same whole. It seems elementary, but that needs both intellect and it needs also emotion. Emotions are created by experiences, not by treaties, not by decrees, not by command. This is why I think projects like the Erasmus for students and so on are extremely crucial. Living with others, being part of their life is the best way to start identifying and being able to see things from their point of view, even if it's not necessarily the same point of view as yours. Well, as a former refugee, you see, I think that here again, the reactions to the situation have been very simplistic. When I was a refugee child, Europe kicked us out of the European continent. It's as simple as that. There were displaced persons camps in the 3 Western occupation zones of Germany, largely British and American. And starting in 1949, the refugees were told they had to get out of Europe. Post-war Europe had enough difficulties of its own, and that it accepted a very limited number of these refugees. So yes, some stayed in Germany, Denmark, Britain, Sweden, but most were told, you have to leave. And these are born Europeans from Eastern Europe, having fled from communism. That's in my lifetime. Now at the end of my life, I'm told there are people coming into Europe, and how come Europe is not more open to them? And I say to myself, well, when we were there as refugees, the question was, is Europe able to accept them? The West Germany of 1949 didn't look like it could. A few years later, it had to import thousands and thousands of workers from Turkey because its economy developed, and all of a sudden it could accept people. But in 1949, in 1950, 1951, it said you have to go to Australia to work in stone quarries, or to Brazil to pick coffee, or to clear land in the jungle, and stuff like that. Herd sheep in New Zealand for the lucky ones, and so that sort of thing. Can Europe, the question to be asked is, when people start flooding in, all of a sudden, and clearly there was a market, if you like, a black market for bringing in refugees. These people sold all they owed, they borrowed money, because they were told that you can get into Europe and have a better life. And the influx of refugees was absolutely abnormal. So first of all, I think that the defect was, once they arrived in Europe, you had a crisis. But the root of the crisis was before they arrived in Europe. What was it that was driving them away from where they lived? And could something be done about that? And then once they arrived in Europe, you had to think about the absorption capacity of the European Union. If the European Union took years for each country before it was accepted in the European Union, because they said we cannot absorb new members until they are ready, the question is, can a country accept and unlimited, as Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of the Chancellor of the German Federal Republic, announced in a spontaneous outpouring of generosity. But you see, there are practical things. Could Europe actually accept an unlimited number of refugees? I don't think it can. So the question was about how to practically solve the question. Where do you put the refugees? How do you absorb them? And it was all by saying, well, Europeans are not open up. This is a practical question. When thousands of refugees arrived, we saw what happens on Lampedusa, we saw what happens on Greek islands. It is not something that you solve by saying we should. The question is, how can we do it? I'm pleasantly surprised that we've reached Russia this late in our interview. Because when I arrived back in my native country and became its president, when foreign visitors, journalists came to interview me, I naively expected as a child of refugees that they would ask about the sufferings of Latvian people during the deportations, about the fact that so many were driven into exile, about the traumas that they went through. Oh, no. we were being asked why we were oppressing the Russian speakers who arrived during the Soviet occupation and who refused to learn Latvian, by asking them to learn Latvian in order to get citizenship. And I did not get one question, not one, about the Latvian people, not one, but about how we were oppressing the Russians, it seems, by asking them to learn the language of the land, where some say, but they had been living there a long time. Well, exactly. Well, we'd like to go back to our own language, not one imposed on us by a military occupation. We should really say, frankly, that Russia is definitely an anti-democratic system. It is a populist one. It is an authoritarian one. It is a hierarchical one. And it's one where organized crime and politics are very deeply embedded into each other. In my considered opinion, the leadership of President Putin has developed this particular model of what he calls, I think, frankly, mockingly, as guided democracy. I forget what the term he uses exactly. It's a mockery of democracy. And it is, yes, it is a danger to Europe, especially a danger if Europeans do not realize how different ideologically and fundamentally this is. By the way, talk about nationalism in the negative sense of the word, the glorification of the victory of the Red Army in the Second World War, and the justification of Stalinist crimes simply because of the fact that Stalin, after 2 years of being Hitler's ally, being invaded by Hitler, of course, had to fight against him, is grotesque. Russia, to my mind, is a country to be watched with caution, and frankly, to hope that modern communication, media of communication, will slowly, somehow allow certain ideas of democracy to percolate into that country. But imagine if Europe itself is losing faith in its democracy, then of course, how can they percolate into others or serve as models? So this is like the American democracy as the shining city on a hill, a model of democracy to the world, and we saw what happened on the 6th of January. So Europe better watch out, that's all I can say.